By 1890, the engine of global development was churning out reams of steel, bars of gold, hordes of canned meat, and great billowing clouds of choking black smoke. Coal and oil ruled the day, and it seemed to simply be available wherever one stepped. The ground had rich veins of anthracite coal and vast untapped wells of rich oil. The population boomed across the civilized world, and indeed in those savage lands that they administered. It is notable that, though the population of laborers the world over had increased by the millions, the Ming Empire having 25 million on its own, the slave population had plummeted, the regional African power of Mali having the most, numbering them at 500,000 slaves. Ironic that they were not able to stop the Europeans, and now became the largest proprietors of their once so hated evil. Of the 15 countries that still had slaves, only one was European, Alençon, and one was even a democracy, the struggling, impoverished Republic of Colombia, which couldn't afford to relinquish her 12,000 slaves. The rest of the world had, largely, not bothered to outlaw it, instead moving on to a system of cheap factory labor and abandoning traditional slavery in favor of a kind of informal wage slavery. This was especially the case in the Volksreich, which had the greatest number of capitalists in the world, with 11,000 individual major investors with holdings over 50,000 ducats. It was in this year, too, that the great powers were re-examined, and a new official map was drafted for international use, due to recent events and an improvement in cartographic technology. Beginning with the great powers, they were now listed as the Magyarország at the front of the pack, followed by the Volksreich, Ireland, Aquitania, the Ming Empire, Aksu, the Russian Empire, and finally Japan. Geographically, the map begins with Europe, depicting a state of affairs rather similar to the last edition of the map. The greatest changes as of late could not be seen on a sheet of paper. For example, the Volksreich, under Kaiser Erhard VI von Formbach, which remained dominant in the heart of Europe, was a hotbed of capital, and was the driving economic engine of the Western world. Volkish imports of raw materials kept demand high, and Volkish exports of finished goods kept currency turnover and exchange at a healthy pace. Aquitania's optimism was gone, the country's final hopes placed entirely in the well-being of the dual alliance. This stoked an introspection that caused the empire to transition from energetic discourse and wide, sunny public spaces and into concentrated academia, sprawling universities filled with hermit scholars and students flitting about dressed in the brooding Irish style. Their emperor, Philippe VII Coëlon, diverted much funding from the army and towards the dual pursuits of higher education and law enforcement, hoping to quell the unrest that the common man was liable to level at him. He also ensured that Aquitanian shipping did not betray the turmoil of the system within which it had so thrived. Ireland, under Emperor Virgal Vogan, was a land of utter contention. The crown had imposed martial law across much of the country, and the terrorism of the DVL was proving a great and terrible threat to Irish society. As such, their famed craftsmen suffered and their output fell. The Magyarország, under Emperor Kelemen IV Vancouver, was prosperous beyond imagining. Oil spilled forth across their imperial dominion, and they used it to grease their machines of war, and fired it to fuel their roiling industry. Russia, under Tsar Alexander Blatomil, found itself putting all of its faith into the dual alliance, much like the Aquitanians had. Tsar Alexander, throwing all of his meager industrial might into military production, allowed what workers there were to suffer in order to arm one of the largest armies in Europe, at over 500,000 men. Other notable actors included Africa, which was graceful on the course of its slow decline. Iceland, the frigid thrall of Russia, and Alençon, lorded over by the Volksreich. Even more minor were the kingdoms of Urbino, Lombardia, Sardinia, and Catholic Andalusia, which flitter about the boots of giants as they fought. In this year, the Magyarország had also conquered Kiev, putting an end to the dual theocratic monarchy thereof, and decimating the old Albigensian Church and its desperate idea of a holy kingdom. This only left the Nova Church, a puppet to the crown. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Aksu were stagnating under their Khan, Abdullah Sarangurel, as the Pashchimi Dal had actually managed to halt their advance, standing up against them. The Ming Empire, under Emperor Shu Li, was dominant in the region and was reaping the rewards of industrialism. Their steel mills and munitions factories fed an army of over 3 million men, clothed by 25 million laborers and fed by 65 million farmers. The Ming were a country of scale, of monumentality, and they knew it. Luckily for Europe, they were at present tied up in a kind of Cold War with Japan under Emperor Daigo Gosei. Japan at this point was fully industrialized, but the iron will of the emperor had been absolute ever since the Ashikaga clan won the Sengoku Jidai, later imbuing the Chrysanthemum throne with the power it once held. This meant that, though the country was ostensibly modern, it was ran in a medieval way, and the emperor was willing to throw the unified force of his 700,000 well-trained Imperial Japanese army against the millions of Ming peasants in order to fully supplant them on the world stage. This Cold War between them was galvanized in Southeast Asia, where Japan held Korea and Makassar, with Pasai as a major ally on its side, while the Ming held Lan Na, Cambodia, and Brunei in their sphere of influence. Low-level insurgencies and proxy conflicts would slowly torture the region until war broke out or a winner was declared. Speaking of which, Pasai was prospering due to this Japanese partnership, having received a great deal of military hardware and the exploratory funds to shore up their holdings in Australia, Alaska, and Mexico. Nothing had meanwhile changed in North or South America, industrializing in lockstep with their parent countries, while Africa was further cut up amongst the great powers. The Aquitanians held Algeria, the Magyars took a chunk out of Mali and threatened the Yusufid remnant, the Irish now reached almost to the Indian Ocean, Ifriqiya was holding on to its territory fairly comfortably, and the Magyars had taken all of South Africa and even Madagascar from the Betsimisaraka. If something was about to happen in the world, as it wasn't immediately obvious. Meanwhile, that year, due to the academic fervor of the Aquitanian scholarship, a variety of speculative theories swarmed the world's cafes and academies alike, namely military theory. The talk of 1890 was the theory of a Great War, which was recorded to have first circulated throughout Volkish military academies. The theory held that, as industry scales, so will war, and as society increases in complexity, so will the international network of alliances. Great War theory posited that such a conflict was inevitable. In July, shortly after this theory was published, Russia and Ireland went to war with one another again. Emperor Firgal declared war on the Russians to his north in order to drive them out of Scotland and crush the DVL from within their base of operations, hopefully cutting off their monetary support as well, which came almost entirely from the Russians. In 1891, Ireland won, and regained the Scottish Highlands, devastating Russia and making the dual alliance yet more uncertain of its footing. By January of 1892, due to the fact that Emperor Daigo Gosei had abandoned civilian development in pursuit of his game of Go against Emperor Shuli, Japan underwent a liberal revolution, knocking the country from the list of great powers, only to be replaced by the ascendant nation of Bengal. A cabal of Japanese aristocrats and businessmen led this revolt, and during this bloody internal conflict, Japan would come under the sphere of influence of the Volksreich. This protected them from Emperor Shuli's hungry eyes, but sowed enmity between the Ming and the Volksreich. By 1896, Kaiser Urart VI changed tracks from widespread industrialization to general militarization. The last major war was won almost by numbers alone, and the Kaiser wanted to be up to the coming century's standards of military technology. Guards and artillery were mass-produced, while the Engineers Corps was introduced to act as support for war machines like artillery or infantry transport. The Guard Corps was also introduced as a new soldier, well-equipped and prepared for protracted conflict behind enemy lines. Their gear was far more substantial than that of the infantrymen, and was more physically fit than the cuirassier, who was quickly losing relevance while still making up the bulk of Volkish forces. The Guard was here to replace the fabled cavalry. Another policy of the Volksreich took shape in the form of foreign relations concerning a former enemy, the Magyarország. Ultimately, in order to prevent being surrounded on the continent, the Kaiser hoped to foster a closer relationship with them. Meanwhile, in 1898, Japan emerged from its civil war a constitutional monarchy under the emperor's nephew, Oj Gosei, and Prime Minister Okuma Gichi. Japan wasted no time and regained its seat among the great powers, now a inward-focused, hyper-capitalist empire which proved remarkably well for its development. While the Ming Emperor Shu Li breathed a breath of relief for now, he was still unsettled when he heard the Japanese had miles of more railroad track than all of China. In 1899, the Volksreich was chosen to host the second Olympic Games, which would be held in the capital Stettin. These games went well, though embarrassingly, Volkish athletes brought home no gold medals. Erhard VI died shortly thereafter, supposedly of a fever caught in the stands, leaving his young son Erhard VII von Formbach to inherit the throne. In April of that year, Siam was added to the Volkish sphere of influence, a sorry replacement for the sheer value that Japan provided them. In this way, the Volksreich would never stop pursuing an alliance with the Japanese until they got one. By 1899, the world seemed to be waiting with bated breath on something. Tensions were everywhere, but like a chamber of magma, nobody knew where it was going to burst forth first. The Russians wanted to take the Baltic states back from the Volksreich. The Magyarország was militarizing and was generally angry at the Volksreich for its continuing embargo on oil machinery. The Ming were eyeing Japan. Aquitania was suffering social strife and radical politics, and the Aksu were powerless to prevent another power from storming across its dunes and rocky crags to call them their own. Whatever lurked in wait around the corner into the next century, nobody knew anything about it, except that it was there and getting closer.